From a president who let the Union fall apart to a president resigning to avoid being criminally prosecuted for his abuse of power, these are the worst presidents in American history. James Buchanan took office in 1857 with the nation already on the verge of falling apart. Southern states were growing restless as tensions over slavery reached a boiling point. The country needed decisive leadership. Instead, Buchanan hesitated. He believed the Constitution left him no choice but to do nothing, convinced that avoiding conflict would somehow keep the Union together. States began withdrawing. His indecision only gave them confidence. Letters piled up, advisors pleaded for action, but he stayed rooted in misplaced optimism, refusing to confront the crisis head-on. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office, the stage for war was fully set. Buchanan's presidency became a textbook example of how doing nothing in the face of disaster can make things far worse. Then there was a president who actively fueled corruption. When Andrew Johnson came into office, the country was still recovering from the Civil War. That meant the nation's future rested on how Reconstruction would be handled. And instead of protecting the rights of newly freed slaves and stabilizing the South, Johnson decided to side with previous Confederates and vetoed legislation that was meant to secure civil rights. This resulted in constant clashes. Congress was frustrated by his stubborn refusal to act decisively. Over time, his lack of action made lawmakers stop looking to him for leadership. He showed that real leadership requires timely action when people are counting on you. And when he failed to do so, it resulted in prolonged suffering, leaving dangerous precedents in a fragile post-war nation. But some presidents managed to combine corruption with chaos. Warren G. Harding promised something the nation was longing for, a return to normalcy. Unfortunately, he was quickly caught up in scandal. From the Teapot Dome bribery to rampant favoritism in his cabinet, corruption spread like absolute wildfire. Officials were literally selling government favors like stock tips. And Harding? Well, he either ignored it or simply didn't realize the magnitude until it was too late. And soon, scandals unfolded much like a modern corporate collapse. Senior-most officials cut corners while the president projected public confidence. Being unable to identify that and blindly trusting his inner circle caused the administration to weaken. The public was outraged and saw him as a leader whose failure to control his team caused widespread damage. And corruption wasn't limited to one administration. Franklin Pierce believed compromise was what would calm the nation. His optimism quickly backfired. His support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the slavery debate, effectively overturning decades of fragile progress. Violence erupted in Kansas, with pro- and anti-slavery forces clashing in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce's decision not only failed to prevent conflict, but directly fueled it. He behaved like minor fixes would save the situation, despite the country heading straight for disaster. And just like that, the country slipped closer to civil war. Pierce was the perfect example of how misjudged policies, no matter how well-intentioned, can raise tensions and leave consequences for generations to come. Sometimes, bad policy came with catastrophic timing. Zachary Taylor's sudden death made way for Millard Fillmore to step into office. He quickly made choices that would go on to haunt him. To start off, he enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a law many saw as morally wrong and supported political compromises meant to keep the Union together. On the surface, these moves looked like safe and pragmatic decisions, but they came at a heavy cost. By ignoring the moral urgency of slavery, Fillmore was allowing injustice to persist and tensions to rise. And that was what set the stage for much deeper national conflict. It was like trying to play it safe made the problems far worse. This proved that morally blind compromise can define a leader just as much as bold failure. It doesn't end there. There were presidents that actively worsened crises. Now, Ulysses S. Grant entered the White House as a national hero. He was renowned for leading the Union to victory. However, his skills on the battlefield didn't quite translate to politics. His presidency was also plagued by corruption, with scandals like the whiskey ring and nepotism undermining public trust. Close associates very openly exploited their positions, while Grant simply failed to intervene. It was like a classic example of leadership mismatch. Although he excelled on the battlefield, the presidency required skills he had not yet developed. And despite his personal honesty, he allowed massive mismanagement, leaving behind both triumph and rather avoidable chaos. And when incompetence meets ambition, the results can be explosive. Because when Herbert Hoover entered the presidency, he was a well-reputed and skilled administrator and humanitarian. But the stock market crash of 1929 ended up exposing his limited approach. He believed in voluntary cooperation and limited government intervention. However, as businesses crumbled and unemployment went on the rise, millions of Americans faced non-stop hardships. Families started losing homes, children started going hungry, and whole communities struggled to survive. The public perception turned quickly, seeing Hoover as distant and ineffective. Hoover believed economic recovery would occur naturally, with limited government intervention. His reliance on cautious optimism and faith in the system made the crisis worse, branding him as the president associated with the Great Depression. Yet economic failure wasn't the only way to leave a bad impression. Because Richard Nixon gave us a lesson in how secrecy and paranoia can compromise trust. With polished speeches and political successes, the administration engaged in illegal surveillance, break-ins, and cover-ups that eventually exploded into the Watergate scandal. It was Nixon's hiding the truth and manipulating the system that made things worse. The nation watched as public confidence in the presidency eroded. Even today, it's easy to spot similarities in corporate or political scandals, where leaders alter rules until everything collapses. Fearing the oncoming impeachment, Nixon resigned and became the first president to leave office in disgrace. Hiding behind power or process can't save a failing presidency. At the end of the day, it destroys everything that was built along the way. And some presidents managed to fail both morally and politically. Jimmy Carter came into office with sincerity and a focus on human rights. Sadly, good intentions weren't enough to get through the crises he faced. The energy crisis had Americans waiting in long gas lines while struggling with rising prices. And his responses often felt overly cautious or just ineffective. Internationally, the Iran hostage situation dominated headlines, making the nation feel powerless as negotiations dragged on for months. No doubt that Carter's heart was in the right place, but execution fell way shorter than what the nation actually needed. In short, he was a well-meaning leader who struggled in the face of a complex challenge. Empathy and integrity matter, sure, but without decisive action, they can't prevent public disappointment, especially the kind Carter ended up facing. George W. Bush's presidency was defined by high-stakes decisions with far-reaching consequences. Why? How about the Iraq War, which was launched on the belief that weapons of mass destruction existed? It led to years of conflict, instability, and countless lives lost, all while reshaping the Middle East in ways that are still felt today. Domestically, the 2008 financial crisis exposed vulnerabilities in regulation and oversight, leaving millions facing unemployment, home foreclosures, and economic uncertainty. Bush's actions are a perfect example of how choices at the top ripple across generations, influencing both foreign policy and domestic trust in government. Even now, debates over war, surveillance, and economic policy trace back to his decisions. If only presidents were more concerned about the decisions' impacts and how they extend well beyond the term in office. Looking back at these presidencies, how would you handle the weight of leading a nation?